All right, so I thought I'd give another update on my festival experiences. So I've just come back from a festival called AUM Festival, which is just held just outside of Auckland, in New Zealand. And it's kind of like a psytrance uh, dance festival, really, but they have a healing blade, and it's in a very quiet area of the location. And so I was up there both days for 9 hours and did about 25 hand readings, mostly quite short ones, but nonetheless some very powerful ones. And I thought I'd share some of those with you today. Um, so there's kind of like there were some obvious themes that kept coming up. I mean, there were things that kept happening on both the days where I'd see similar kind of hand features occurring. So probably the most common things were the separated air and the earth line. So where the air and the earth line start at the beginning, normally these two lines are joined, but in about 85% of cases, they are joined. In about 15% of cases, they're separated. And a separation of those two lines always indicates a lack of sense of support or lack of closeness with the family during when the person's growing up. So it's kind of one of the indicators in the hand of a particular kind of trauma pattern. And it was a very potent conversation that I had with a number of people on specifically on that issue. Um, and another hand feature that was quite common over the course of the weekend was a radial loop on the index finger. And as you probably know, the radial loop is the fourth most common fingerprint pattern. Occurs in about 5% of the fingers of Caucasian people. And when it does occur, it occurs mainly on the index finger. So when I talk about the radial loop, it's really talking about the radial loop as it's found on the index finger. And the index finger, of course, is to do with your sense of self-confidence and your sense of self-worth. And so when there is a so when there is a radial loop on the index finger, what it generally indicates is a very sensitive personality, someone who's very sensitive to criticism and can often indicate a problematic relationship with the parent, usually the parent of the same gender, when they were a child, and they often experience their parent as being quite critical. It's those both those patterns were quite notable in their sort of the frequency with which they occurred over the course of the weekend, and it's often like that when you go to places like this. I find that you get themes for the weekend, and those seem to be the themes for this particular weekend. So I had that particular conversation a number of times. There are a lot of people with whirls there as well. So there were a few conversations where I literally just talked about whirls for the entire half an hour. Um, but I'd slightly illustrate some of the other hand features that came up. So, for example, on the first day, we had a woman who was a therapist and a musician. She was one of the people with radial loops. So, radial loops on the index finger make very empathic people. People are very good at listening. But she also had loops of sensitivity as well. So, the loop of sensitivity in this area of the hand, giving kind of intuitive relationship with the world and an intuitive ability to pick up things about other people. Um, then there was a dancer. Classic things you'd expect to see in someone who's a dancer. You'd expect to see someone with a fire textured skin. You'd expect to see someone with a very well developed uh, ball of the thumb and this area of the hand here. And she was also used to work out and do sort of lots of physical exercise in the gym as well. So very strong, physically energetic person. And the combination of that with the fire skin texture, it was quite clear that she was kind of working with her body, and she'd been a dancer and now she's a yoga teacher, and that whole kind of somatic approach to healing is something that she was doing. She was actually working in the Zen Tai Shiatsu tent. Um, and one of the most interesting hands that I came across on the first day was this guy, a young man, aged 24, with a water-shaped hand. Now, I don't need to tell you how unusual it is to see a water hand shape in this part of the world. There are some parts of the world where you would expect to see them more frequently, but normally when you see a water hand outside of the Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asia, it's usually in the hands of women and not in the hands of men. And this was a young man who had a water hand shape and an air skin texture. And by virtue of that, immediately I was able to assess something that's quite unique and quite distinctive about him. He also had upper minor water lines too, and that always gives a kind of certain kind of idealism to their sort of temperament when you have an upper minor water line. Someone who kind of wants, who's kind of dreamy, or someone who's inspirational, idealistic, or wants to see the world in a particular kind of way, and always wants to elevate their life in some kind of way. And of course, this is exactly what this happened to. 24 years old, he'd already studied Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. He'd done Vipassana retreats. His whole life was very orientated towards the spiritual and the metaphysical. And he had been in academia, and clearly being that sensitive with that kind of hand shape, it's a very good space to be, because the academic world is quite protected and quite sheltered in that kind of way. But he's clearly, what he wanted to be really was in some kind of monastery or kind of some kind of spiritual environment. But it's an absolute classic combination when you have a water skin texture, a water hand shape, and an air skin texture for something like psychotherapy and counseling. And that's in fact what he's decided he wants to go and do. So it was a real pleasure to meet him, because it's really rare to encounter somebody with that hand shape. Even more rare to encounter somebody who's a male with that hand shape, and quite rare to encounter somebody who's got quite a lot of degree of self-awareness around what their pattern means for them and how they're choosing to live their life. So that was an incredibly interesting hand reading to do. And then the last hand reading of the day is one of those slightly awkward ones where the partner wants her hand read, and she pays for the husband to have his hands read too. And this was a really quite unusual guy, who was about 63 or something like that, married to a much younger woman and they've just had a child together, a 2-year-old child together. I didn't ask about the circumstances of how that all came about. But anyway, he was like, "Oh yeah, whatever. I don't really, whatever. Just say what you want, you know." And I said, "Do you really want to have this hand? Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, whatever. Let's just go for it." And I had him in tears within 4 or 5 minutes. He was laughing, because he had 8 arch fingerprint patterns, earthy skin texture. And so it was kind of very easy to describe his personality, his likes, his preferences, his dislikes, and so on, because he was such an extreme version of the earth element. And obviously that comes with the kind of skepticism. Earth element always is quite cautious, quite skeptical. So he was kind of quite blown away, and I just decided to be quite direct, go straight into it, and just get stuck into all of this. But the turning point when I came to talk about his separated air and earth lines, and his separated air and earth lines, is when we talked about that and his broken family, and how he was the oldest of 7 siblings and he had to look after them all. And that he got no emotional support from his family during that time, and that's when the tears started flowing. So it's important to know about this when you're doing hand reading, that sometimes you will touch quite deep wounds in people, and actually the act of holding space and the act of listening to them and act of identifying patterns of their experience can be incredibly therapeutic for people. um, so he went away completely happy. You know, he was like blown away, and like his skepticism was completely um, dissolved. And it was a glorious reading for him to have experience as well. Fortunately, he recorded it, and obviously that's another really good thing to do. In the intensity of the moment, it's quite difficult for people sometimes to remember all the details of what you go through. So do always recommend to your clients that they actually record it, and it's very easy to do that these days on the phones, of course. Um, then they can go back to it and listen to it later, and they've got more time to take it in and take on board the points that you make. All right, so that's the end of the first day at AUM Festival. So a short little presentation on that. I'll do another one in a minute on the second day at AUM Festival. So I'll see you soon.